If you've ever been written out of your own story, not with hate, but silence, then maybe this will sound familiar. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and realize the conversation stops just long enough for you to notice, when family photos get cropped to balance the frame, when your own mother introduces you to strangers as my other daughter, with that particular pause that says everything she's not saying. My name is Madeline Harper, middle daughter, the one they don't talk about at holiday dinners. They say I quit, that I didn't have what it takes, that I walked away from West Point after my sophomore year because the pressure got to me because I couldn't handle the discipline, because some people just aren't cut out for service. What they don't say is, I was pulled out and buried quietly. I didn't leave the military. I disappeared into it, into rooms with no windows and missions with no names, into places where your signature on a document could save 30 lives or end a career where success is measured not by medals, but by how well you can vanish after the job is done. For 20 years, I've been a ghost. Not dead, just invisible. The kind of operative who writes the plans that others execute, who makes the decisions that others take credit for, who sits in congressional briefings under aliases and watches senators debate strategies I designed. My family thinks I work in government administration. They're not wrong. I administer the kind of government work that keeps senators awake at night and makes foreign ministers change their vacation plans. My sister Erica. She's about to pin lieutenant colonel. Rising star. The family's pride and joy. The one who actually stayed visible, climbed the ranks. The traditional way earned her stripes where everyone could see them. She's everything they wanted in a daughter who serves photogenic, quotable, promotable. At Thanksgiving, they hang her commendations on the mantle like Christmas ornaments. My achievements live in filing cabinets 3 levels underground in buildings that officially don't exist. I sent birthday flowers to my mother last year. She thanked me for thinking of her from wherever you are these days. I was 40 miles away coordinating a NATO intelligence operation that would prevent a humanitarian crisis in Eastern Europe. But to her, I might as well have been on Mars. The distance wasn't geographical. It was deliberate. You see, there's a particular kind of erasure that happens in military families. It's not cruel exactly, it's practical. When one daughter brings home medals and newspaper clippings and photo opportunities with generals, and the other daughter brings home nothing you can display, well, the choice writes itself. They cropped me out of family photos not because they hated me, but because my absence made the frame look more complete. I became the missing piece that made everyone else fit better together. My father, Colonel James Harper, retired Air Force, still introduces Erica as my daughter, the officer. When my name comes up, which it rarely does, I'm Maddie. She's doing her own thing. The pause between she's and contains 20 years of disappointment wrapped in politeness. My mother collects Erica's press clippings in a leather scrapbook. She keeps my letters in a shoebox under the guest room bed. Not hidden exactly, just stored. The thing about being invisible is that people forget you can see them. They forget you're watching when they light up talking about your sister's latest promotion. They forget you're listening when they explain to relatives why there are only 2 place settings at Christmas dinner instead of 3. Maddie's so busy with work, they'll tell who you are. They'll say, you know how it is. I do know how it is. I know because I chose it, or maybe it chose me. The line between voluntary exile and involuntary erasure gets blurry after 2 decades. But here's what I also know: silence has weight. And eventually that weight shifts. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter, official letterhead Pentagon return address, the kind of correspondence that doesn't find you by accident. You are requested under protocol. 17 prior clearance observers may be present for record clarification. Erica's promotion was being reviewed. Some minor inconsistencies in her service record. Nothing serious, probably just paperwork errors. But military bureaucracy is thorough, and when they audit a file, they audit everything connected to it, including family members with security clearances, including ghosts who were never supposed to surface. My mother called the next day. This is about Erica's future, she said. Her voice had that careful control she uses for important conversations. Please don't say anything inconvenient. Inconvenient. That's what I'd become. Not a daughter, not a sister, not a decorated intelligence officer who'd spent 2 decades serving her country in ways that would never make the evening news. Just an inconvenience. I told her I'd be there. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I planned to destroy Erica's career or embarrass my family or finally demand the recognition I'd been denied. I said yes because something inside me, something that had been quiet for 20 years, finally whispered enough. This story isn't about revenge. It's about finally being heard. It's about what happens when the ghost decides to speak. And sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to people who've written you out of their story is simply show up and remind them who you really are. To understand how I became a ghost, you need to know what I was before I disappeared. At the Air Force Academy, I wasn't the cadet who ran the fastest or shouted the loudest. I was the one who watched, who noticed that Roberts always checked his watch before lying, that Martinez's voice dropped half an octave when she was calculating angles of deception, that group dynamics shifted like weather patterns predictable if you knew how to read the signs. My specialty was strategic psychology, not the textbook kind where you memorize theories about crowd behavior and decision trees. The practical kind. The kind that lets you walk into a room and know who's really in charge, who's scared, who's compensating, and who's 3 seconds away from making a mistake that will cost lives. My professors called it intuitive tactical analysis. My classmates called it creepy. I called it useful. By sophomore year, I was scoring in the top percentile on psychological warfare simulations. I could design scenarios that would make enemy commanders second-guess their own shadows. I could craft disinformation campaigns that would turn allies against each other without firing a shot. That's when the letter came, not from the academy, from people who didn't put their real names on letterhead. Cadet Harper, your academic profile has been flagged for interagency assessment. Report to Building 47 at Aero 800 tomorrow. Bring nothing. Tell no one. Building 47 didn't exist on any campus map. The room was gray walls, gray table, gray chairs. 3 people in gray suits who looked like they'd been pressed from the same mold. They didn't introduce themselves. They just slid a folder across the table. "What do you see?" the woman asked. Inside were photographs. Surveillance shots of men in a marketplace, satellite images of a compound, financial records with sections blacked out. I studied them for maybe 30 seconds. "A network, what?" I said. "But not the one you think. These men aren't the real players. They're bait. The actual operation is running through the women in the background, the vendors, the money changers." Classic misdirection. The man on the left made a note. The woman leaned forward. "How would you dismantle it?" I looked at the photos again. You don't attack the network. You make it attack itself. Create false communications that suggest one cell is planning to eliminate another. Let paranoia do the work. Within 6 weeks, they'll destroy themselves from the inside. The room went quiet. Then the third person, who hadn't spoken yet, asked, "Are you willing to disappear for a while, Cadet Harper?" I should have asked what that meant. I should have called my father, consulted my advisor, thought it through. Instead, I heard myself say, yes. 2 weeks later, my academy records showed a medical withdrawal. Stress-related. The official story was that I couldn't handle the pressure, that I'd requested reassignment to civilian academic programs. My family received a letter explaining that I needed time to reassess my commitment to military service. They believed it. Of course they believed it. It fit the narrative they'd already written about me, the daughter who was smart enough to get in, but not tough enough to finish. What actually happened was that I was transferred under an interagency directive. Compartmentalized assignment. My new identity was Civilian Contractor Defense Intelligence Agency, Strategic Psychology Specialist. I didn't wear a uniform. I didn't have a rank. I didn't exist in any database that my family could access. For 3 years, I lived in apartments with fake names on the lease, carried identification that changed every 6 months, and designed psychological operations that the Pentagon would later claim never happened. Then came Operation Black Viper. The target was a rogue network operating across 3 countries, not terrorists exactly, but arms dealers with connections to groups that made terrorists look like amateur hour. They were smart, well-funded, and invisible to traditional intelligence gathering. My job was simple: make them visible, then make them gone. But not through raids or drone strikes, or any of the loud, messy tactics that leave bodies in headlines. Through psychological dismantling. I was going to make them destroy themselves so thoroughly that no one would remember they'd ever existed. It took 8 months of planning. I studied their communication patterns, identified their power structures, mapped their personal relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. I crafted a campaign of disinformation so subtle that each member of the network would receive exactly the information needed to make them believe that their closest allies were planning to betray them. No bombs, no bullets, just carefully placed whispers that would grow into screams. The operation launched on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, the network had collapsed. Not from external pressure, but from internal paranoia. Leaders eliminated each other, safe houses were abandoned weapons, caches were destroyed by the very people who'd built them. 37 potential terrorist attacks were prevented. 6 government coups were avoided. An estimated 12,000 civilian lives were saved. The problem was that our psychological campaign had been so effective that it embarrassed certain allied intelligence services who'd been tracking the same network for years without results. Suddenly, questions were being asked about American capabilities, about operations that weren't supposed to exist, about civilian contractors who had access to information that even career intelligence officers couldn't obtain. To keep diplomatic peace, my name was scrubbed from everything. No medal, no press, no plaque. Just a locked file in a server no one talks about. But the military needed a visible face for the operation. Someone they could parade in front of cameras. Someone with actual rank and credentials and a story that made sense to congressional oversight committees. Enter my sister Erica. She'd been assigned logistics support in the final weeks of Black Viper, organizing safe transport for extracted assets, coordinating with local law enforcement. Important work, but peripheral to the actual psychological operation. When the Pentagon needed someone to credit publicly, her name was already in the files. She was photogenic, articulate, and had actually been present for the mission's conclusion. Perfect. The first news article appeared 6 months later. Lieutenant Erica Harper, the strategic mind behind Operation Black Viper. By the time I saw it, the narrative had calcified into truth. My family read the articles, they saw the interviews. They watched Erica receive commendations for innovative strategic thinking and psychological warfare expertise that had somehow become hers. I couldn't correct them. My security clearance forbade me from discussing anything related to the operation. I couldn't even acknowledge that Black Viper had existed, let alone that I'd designed it. So I watched from the shadows as my sister became the family hero. I watched my parents frame her newspaper clippings. I watched them beam with pride at military functions, where officers would approach them to praise their daughter's groundbreaking work in strategic intelligence. They never asked why I'd suddenly disappeared from their conversations. They never wondered why I stopped calling, as often stopped visiting for holidays. The erasure was so gradual, so natural, that it felt like a tide going out, rather than a deliberate drowning. Erica became the daughter who served with distinction. I became the daughter who couldn't make it through the academy. And for 20 years, I let them believe it. Because sometimes the greatest service you can provide is allowing others to take credit for your sacrifice. But that was before the letter arrived, before Protocol 17, before my ghost was summoned back to explain inconsistencies in a story that was never mine to begin with. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, slipped between credit card offers and grocery store circulars, like it belonged there. Official Pentagon letterhead, the kind of heavy paper that feels important between your fingers. I almost didn't open it. 20 years of living as a ghost teaches you that most correspondence from your former life brings nothing but complications. But something about the envelope felt different, heavier, like it was carrying more than just words. Ms. Madeline Harper, you are requested under Protocol 17. Prior clearance observers may be present for record clarification. Report to Pentagon Building C, Room 4, Pasai, A27, October 30th at 0900 hours. Protocol 17. I had to think for a moment to remember what that meant. Then it came back to me, a bureaucratic footnote, buried in the Intelligence Oversight Manual. When military personnel undergo ethics reviews, anyone with relevant security clearance and operational knowledge can be called as an observer. Not a witness, not a participant. An observer. Someone who sits quietly in the back and watches the proceedings, available to clarify technical details if questions arise about classified operations. Someone who officially isn't supposed to exist, but whose knowledge might be necessary to untangle complex security issues. The letter was signed by Colonel Patricia Adler, Joint Military Ethics Review Board. I didn't recognize the name, but the signature was confident, decisive. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd never had to justify her existence to a room full of skeptics. At the bottom, in smaller print, review concerns Lieutenant Colonel candidate Erica Harper, operational history, 2019-2024. Erica, up for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel. Of course she was. I set the letter on my kitchen table and stared at it while my coffee grew cold. 20 years. 20 years of silence, of distance, of letting my family believe their version of events. 20 years of watching from the shadows while my sister built a career on foundations I'd laid. And now they needed me to clarify inconsistencies. What kind of inconsistencies could there be in a story so carefully constructed? What loose threads had someone found in the narrative that painted Erica as the strategic mind behind Black Viper? My phone rang before I could finish the thought. Mom's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering, already knowing what she was going to say. Maddie, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Her voice had that careful politeness she used when she needed something. Not the warmth she saved for conversations with Erica, but not quite the distant concern she usually offered me either. What's up, Mom? I'm sure you got the letter about Erica's review. So she knew, of course she knew. In military families, information travels faster than gossip, especially when it concerns the family's golden child. I got it, I said. A pause. I could hear her measuring her words, calculating the exact tone needed to get what she wanted, without offending me too much to comply. This is just routine, she said, finally. You know how the Pentagon is about paperwork. They're being thorough, that's all. Probably just need to verify some technical details about old operations. Probably. Another pause. Longer this time. Maddie, this is about Erica's future, her whole career. Lieutenant Colonel is a big step, and if there are any misunderstandings about her service record. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication hung between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. What exactly are you asking me, Mom? I'm asking you to remember that family comes first. That whatever happened in the past, Erica has worked hard to get where she is. She deserves this promotion. Deserves. The word sat heavy in my chest. What did any of us deserve? Did I deserve to have my life's work credited to someone else? Did Erica deserve recognition for strategies she'd never conceived? Did my family deserve the comfort of a simple story where one daughter succeeded and the other simply faded away? I'm not planning to sabotage anything, I said. I know you're not, I know you wouldn't. But sometimes the truth can be inconvenient. There it was again. Inconvenient. 20 years of classified service reduced to an inconvenience that might complicate the family narrative. I'll be there, I told her. Thank you, and Maddie, maybe just keep things simple. You know how these military people can be. They like clean stories. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night I pulled out my copy of the Black Viper operational summary, the heavily redacted version that had been declassified 5 years ago. Most of the strategic details were blacked out. But Erica's name appeared 17 times. Mine appeared 0 times. I read through the sanitized account of psychological operations I'd designed, coordination strategies I'd implemented, intelligence networks I'd carefully dismantled. All of it attributed to other people. Most of it attributed to my sister. The official record stated that Lieutenant Erica Harper had demonstrated exceptional strategic thinking and innovative psychological warfare techniques that resulted in the complete neutralization of hostile networks without loss of allied personnel. Innovative psychological warfare techniques. I'd spent 8 months developing those techniques. 8 months studying behavioral patterns, mapping social hierarchies, crafting the precise psychological pressures needed to make enemies destroy themselves. But according to this report, it was Erica's innovation, Erica's strategic thinking, Erica's success. I closed the file and looked at my reflection in the dark window. 43 years old. Lines around my eyes from squinting at classified documents in basement offices. Gray threading through hair that used to be the same shade as Erica's. 2 decades of being invisible had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'd become comfortable in the shadows, expert at existing without acknowledgement. I'd convinced myself that the work mattered more than the recognition that saving lives was worth any personal cost. But sitting there in my quiet apartment, holding a letter that summoned me back to explain inconsistencies in my own erased history, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet recognition that silence has its own weight, and I'd been carrying it long enough. I wasn't going to that hearing for revenge. I wasn't planning to destroy Erica's career or demand recognition for operations I'd never be allowed to fully discuss. I was going because for the first time in 20 years, someone was asking questions about a story that had never quite made sense. Someone was looking for clarification about inconsistencies that I'd been living with in silence. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the truth clarify itself. Pentagon Building C was exactly as I remembered it. All polished floors and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. I'd walked these halls before years ago when I was still young enough to believe that truth and recognition went hand in hand. Now I knew better. Room 4A27 was a subchamber buried 3 floors down, the kind of space designed for conversations that weren't supposed to leave permanent records. Beige walls, conference table for 12 American flag in the corner, standing at attention like a silent witness. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back corner exactly where the letter had instructed. The placard in front of my chair read, "Civilian Observer, Prior Clearance." No name, just a function. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy blazer, white blouse, minimal jewelry. The kind of outfit that suggested competence without demanding attention. After 2 decades of invisibility, I'd learned how to inhabit spaces without disturbing them. The ethics review board filed in first 3 officers with the tired expressions of people who'd seen every possible variation of military misconduct and found none of it particularly surprising. They nodded in my direction with the polite disinterest reserved for furniture. Then came the supporting cast. A stenographer who set up her machine with mechanical precision. A junior aide who arranged folders with the obsessive care of someone whose career depended on perfect organization. My parents entered together, Dad in his dress uniform, despite being retired. Mom in a conservative pantsuit that screamed, "respectable military wife." They spotted me immediately, but didn't wave, didn't smile, just offered the kind of acknowledging nod you'd give a distant acquaintance at a funeral. Erica was the last to arrive before the proceedings began. She swept in wearing her dress blues with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in any room. Her ribbons caught the light as she moved, each one a small monument to achievements both real and borrowed. She saw me and hesitated for just a moment, a barely perceptible pause that might have been surprise or calculation or simple recognition that the landscape had shifted in ways she couldn't quite map. Then she smiled, not warmly but professionally, the kind of smile that acknowledged my presence without inviting conversation. "Thank you all for being here," she said, taking her seat at the front of the room. "I appreciate the thoroughness of this review process, and I'm confident we can resolve any administrative discrepancies quickly." Administrative discrepancies, as if 20 years of borrowed glory could be filed under paperwork errors. The proceedings began with routine formalities. Erica's service record was read aloud, deployments, commendations, leadership positions. When they reached Operation Black Viper, she spoke smoothly about strategic innovation and psychological warfare techniques, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who'd told this story many times. The key breakthrough, she explained, was recognizing that traditional military pressure would only strengthen the target network's resolve. Instead, we implemented a series of carefully calibrated psychological interventions designed to exploit existing paranoia and mistrust within their command structure. I noticed she said we, even though the operational files credited her as the primary strategist. It was a small thing but telling. Even in the moment of claiming credit, some part of her recognized that the work had been collaborative, or maybe she was just hedging her bets. The review board asked technical questions about methodology, about intelligence sources, about operational timelines. Erica answered confidently, displaying a solid understanding of the mission's public details and a careful vagueness about anything that remained classified. She was good at this. I had to give her that. She'd studied the declassified materials, memorized the approved talking points, practiced deflecting inquiries into areas she couldn't discuss. If I hadn't designed the original operation myself, I might have been convinced. That's when the door opened and Colonel Patricia Adler entered. She wasn't what I'd expected. Shorter than her confident signature had suggested, with silver hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that moved across the room like a scanner cataloging everything worth noting. She carried herself with the particular authority of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. She paused mid-step when she reached the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. When her eyes found mine, something clicked into place behind her expression. She blinked twice slowly, like someone trying to bring a distant memory into focus. The room fell silent. Erica's explanation trailed off mid-sentence. Even the stenographer's fingers stopped moving. Colonel Adler's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden stillness. "Wait, you're Harper." The words hung in the air like a held breath. She was looking directly at me now, her expression shifting from recognition to something approaching reverence. "You're the one who took down Black Viper, aren't you?" The room didn't just go quiet, it froze. Time seemed to suspend itself around that simple statement, around the moment when 20 years of careful narrative construction suddenly developed a crack wide enough to let the truth leak through. Erica's face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. The confident posture that had carried her through the morning's testimony collapsed inward, leaving her looking smaller, younger, more fragile than I'd seen her since childhood. My father's eyes found the floor and stayed there, as if the polished surface might offer some escape from the implications of what had just been said. My mother's hands clenched in her lap knuckles, white against the fabric of her skirt. The review board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the kind of inconsistencies they'd been investigating. This wasn't about administrative errors or minor discrepancies in paperwork. This was about fundamental questions of attribution, about whose name belonged on which achievements. Colonel Adler continued to stare at me, waiting for confirmation of something she already knew to be true. I could have spoken. Could have explained the chain of events that had led to this moment, the decisions made in classified rooms by people whose names would never appear in any public record. Could have detailed the months of psychological analysis, the carefully crafted disinformation campaigns, the strategic patience required to make enemies destroy themselves. Instead, I said nothing, because sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is the one you don't make. Sometimes silence carries more weight than any explanation, more truth than any defense. The truth was sitting there in the space between Colonel Adler's recognition and my unspoken confirmation. It didn't need my voice to make it real. It had always been real. The only thing that had been artificial was the story that had grown up around it. You don't need to scream when the truth is louder than silence. Erica's carefully constructed presentation lay in pieces around us, not destroyed by any attack or accusation, but simply revealed as incomplete. The narrative that had sustained our family for 2 decades had just encountered someone who remembered a different version of events, someone who remembered the truth. Colonel Adler finally broke the silence, her voice professional, but touched with something that might have been apology. "I think," she said, "we need to expand the scope of this review." Sitting in that frozen room, watching my family's carefully constructed world crack apart, I found myself pulled back to a different kind of silence, the kind that had started everything. It was March 2019. I was living in a studio apartment in Arlington under the name Sarah Collins, working as a diplomatic consultant for a firm that existed mostly on paper. My real job was analyzing psychological profiles for the Defense Intelligence Agency, mapping the mental landscapes of people who dealt in violence and ideology. That's when General Marcus Webb found me. He didn't make an appointment. He simply appeared at my apartment door one evening wearing civilian clothes, and the kind of expression that suggested the conversation we were about to have would never officially occur. "Ms. Harper," he said, not bothering with my cover identity. "We need someone who thinks like a chess player, but fights like a surgeon." He spread photographs across my kitchen table, like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. Satellite images of compounds scattered across 3 countries. Financial records showing money flowing through a network of shell companies. Intercepted communications that painted a picture of something too organized to be random terrorism, too sophisticated to be simple crime. "They call themselves the Black Viper Collective," Webb explained. "Arms dealers with revolutionary pretensions. They've been supplying weapons to insurgent groups across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. But that's not what keeps me awake at night. He pulled out another photograph, a schematic of some kind of chemical processing facility. Intelligence suggests they're moving into biological agents. Nothing weaponized yet, but the infrastructure is being built. Our analysts estimate they're 6 months away from having the capability to broker deals in materials that could kill thousands. I studied the images, already seeing patterns that others might miss. Traditional military pressure won't work, I said. Hit them hard and they'll scatter, take their knowledge underground. Hit them soft and they'll adapt. Webb nodded. That's why we need a different approach. Something that makes them destroy themselves before they realize what's happening. It took me 3 weeks to design the psychological collapse strategy. 3 weeks of studying personnel files, analyzing communication patterns, mapping the intricate web of relationships that held the network together. The Black Viper Collective wasn't really a collective at all. It was a confederation of independent operators held together by mutual benefit and shared paranoia. Each cell trusted the others just enough to maintain profitable relationships, but not enough to ignore suspicious behavior. That paranoia would be their downfall. I crafted a campaign of surgical disinformation, not crude propaganda, but carefully tailored communications, designed to exploit existing fault lines in their trust structure. Each message was precisely calibrated to the psychological profile of its recipient. To Viktor Kozlov, the financial coordinator with narcissistic tendencies, intelligence suggesting his partners were planning to cut him out of a major deal. To Maria Santos, the logistics chief with abandonment issues stemming from childhood trauma evidence that her closest allies were questioning her loyalty behind closed doors. To Ahmed Hassan, the security coordinator whose father had been betrayed by business partners, financial records showing unusual money transfers that could be interpreted as preparation for elimination. None of it was true. All of it was believable. The operation launched on a Tuesday morning with a single intercepted email. By Friday, 3 separate cells had gone dark, convinced they were being hunted by their former allies. Within 2 weeks, the entire network was cannibalizing itself. No bombs, no raids, no dramatic military operations that would make the evening news, just quiet disruption. A war of the mind that left the enemy's infrastructure intact, but their ability to trust each other completely destroyed. The biological weapons facility was abandoned before it could become operational. The arms supply chains collapsed as suppliers turned against distributors, and distributors turned against clients. An estimated 37 planned attacks were prevented, not because we stopped them, but because the people planning them could no longer work together long enough to execute them. It was the most successful psychological warfare operation in the agency's history. And when it was over, no one clapped. Because success in covert operations is measured by what doesn't happen, by terrorist attacks that never occur, by weapons that never reach their targets, by crises that never develop beyond the theoretical stage. The problem came later when congressional oversight committees started asking questions about counterterrorism successes. When allies who'd been tracking the same networks for years without results demanded explanations for American capabilities they couldn't match. General Webb called me into his office on a Thursday morning 6 months after Black Viper's conclusion. "We have a problem," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Too many people are asking too many questions about operations that officially don't exist." Inside the folder were newspaper articles, congressional hearing transcripts, intelligence reports from allied agencies, all asking variations of the same question. How had the United States achieved such dramatic results against networks that had previously seemed untouchable? "The psychological warfare techniques you developed are too effective," Webb continued. "Other agencies want to know how we did it. They want training cooperation technology transfers. But if we admit to the scope of our psychological operations capabilities, we compromise every future mission that depends on targets underestimating what we can do." I understood immediately. Success had made us vulnerable. By proving what psychological warfare could accomplish, we'd painted a target on every future operation that depended on enemies not knowing we possessed such capabilities. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked. Webb's expression was carefully neutral. "We need to redirect attention. Give them a story they can understand, a face they can photograph, a success they can celebrate without compromising operational security." That's when he mentioned Erica. Lieutenant Erica Harper, who'd been assigned logistics coordination during Black Viper's final phase, who'd handled secure communications and asset extraction, who'd been present for the operation's conclusion, and whose service record could support a narrative of strategic innovation. Your sister has an exemplary record, Webb said. She's photogenic, articulate, and her actual contributions to the mission were substantial enough to make the story believable. More importantly, she has no knowledge of the psychological warfare techniques that we need to keep classified. I stared at him, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. You want to credit her with my work. I want to credit her with strategic planning that led to the mission's success. The specific methodologies remain classified. Your contributions remain classified, but the public gets a hero they can understand, and we protect capabilities that took decades to develop. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for conversations that would never be officially recorded. I'm not asking you to disappear, Madeline. I'm asking you to step back. Let someone else carry the public weight of this success while you continue the work that actually matters. I didn't vanish. I was offered a trade silence in place of scandal. If I insisted on recognition, if I fought to claim credit for Black Viper's psychological warfare innovations, the congressional investigations would intensify. Allied agencies would demand access to classified techniques. Future operations would be compromised before they could begin. But if I stayed quiet, if I let Erica become the public face of strategic success, the real work could continue in the shadows where it belonged. Think of it as operational security, Webb had said. Personal sacrifice in service of national security. Your family will understand. And my family. They called it duty. They never asked why I suddenly stopped talking about my work. They never wondered why my security clearance seemed to evaporate overnight. When Erica's name started appearing in intelligence circles, when articles began praising her innovative strategic thinking, they simply accepted it as natural progression. The daughter who'd always been destined for greatness, finally achieving the recognition she deserved. The daughter who'd never quite measured up, quietly fading into the background where she'd always belonged. Sitting in that Pentagon hearing room, watching Colonel Adler's recognition crack open 20 years of carefully maintained fiction, I finally understood something I'd been too loyal to see before. The trade I'd accepted hadn't just protected operational security. It had protected my family from having to choose between truth and convenience, and they'd chosen convenience anyway. The hotel lobby felt like a stage set after the final curtain, all the props still in place, but the performance over. We sat in a cluster of leather chairs near the windows, the afternoon light casting long shadows across carpet that had seen too many difficult conversations. Colonel Adler had suspended the hearing pending additional investigation. Erica's promotion was officially on hold. The carefully constructed narrative that had sustained our family for 2 decades lay in pieces around us like broken glass, and no one seemed to know how to start cleaning up. My father broke the silence first. He'd changed out of his dress uniform into civilian clothes, but his posture remained military, straight shoulders squared against whatever was coming. 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. 20 years we've been proud of Erica's service. 20 years of celebrating her achievements. He looked at me directly for the first time since Colonel Adler had spoken my name. This moment belongs to Erica. Don't ruin it. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so predictably him. Even now, faced with evidence that the story we'd all been living was incomplete, his first instinct was to protect the version of events that felt most comfortable. I met his gaze without flinching. I was the reason she got it to begin with. My mother's sharp intake of breath cut through the space between us. She'd been silent since leaving the Pentagon, her hands twisted in her lap like she was trying to hold something together through force of will alone. "Maddie, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. Do what? Tell the truth. I've been silent for 20 years. I think I've done enough." My father's jaw tightened. The truth. The truth is that Erica earned her rank through dedication and service. The truth is that she's never disappointed this family, unlike me. He didn't say it, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Dad," I kept my voice level, professional. "I spent 8 months designing the psychological warfare strategy that dismantled the Black Viper network. I identified their vulnerabilities, crafted the disinformation campaign, and coordinated the operation that prevented dozens of terrorist attacks. Erica coordinated logistics. Important work, but not the work that made headlines. That's classified information, he said sharply. I can't just what exists take up space in a story that was always mine. The silence that followed was different from the one in the hearing room. This wasn't the shocked quiet of revelation, but the heavy stillness of family members, realizing they'd been strangers to each other for longer than anyone wanted to admit. My mother stood abruptly. "I need some air," she said, and walked toward the hotel's revolving door without looking back. My father watched her go, then turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition that the world had shifted in ways he couldn't control. "Your sister doesn't deserve this," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "She doesn't, but neither did I." He left without saying goodbye. The knock on my hotel room door came at 11:30 that night. Soft, tentative, the kind of sound someone makes when they're not sure they want to be heard. Erica stood in the hallway wearing jeans and a Georgetown sweatshirt, looking younger than she had in years. Without her uniform, without the confidence that came with rank and recognition, she looked like the little sister who used to follow me around base housing, begging to be included in whatever game I was playing. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside to let her in. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped in front of her, staring at the generic hotel carpet, like it might offer answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said finally. "I know. When they first told me about the commendation, I tried to explain that my role was limited. But they said the operation needed a public face, someone who could speak to media and congressional committees without compromising classified information." She looked up at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. They needed someone they could show. "You were too invisible." I sat down in the chair across from her, studying the face that looked so much like mine, but had lived such a different life. Same bone structure, same stubborn chin. But her features had been softened by years of recognition, of belonging, of never having to question whether she deserved the space she occupied. "No," I said quietly. "I was too real." She blinked, not understanding. My work was too classified, too controversial, too complicated for public consumption. Psychological warfare makes people uncomfortable. It's easier to celebrate traditional military virtues, logistics coordination, leadership, things that look good in newspaper photos. I leaned forward, keeping my voice gentle. "You became the story they could tell. I remained the story they couldn't." Erica was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what I'd said. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting 20 years to hear. "Do you hate me?" I considered it. The honest answer was more complicated than she probably wanted to hear. I hated the situation. I hated watching our parents beam with pride over achievements that weren't yours, while my actual service became something they were embarrassed to mention. I hated being erased from my own life. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But hate you, no. You were as much a victim of this as I was. You just got the more comfortable kind of victimhood." She nodded slowly, tears finally spilling over. "What happens now? Now you tell the truth. To the review board, to the family, to yourself. Not because you have to, but because it's the only way forward that doesn't require someone else to disappear." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache with memories of a sisterhood we'd lost somewhere along the way. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know, but being scared is better than being fake." She stayed for another hour, and for the first time in 20 years, we talked like sisters, instead of strangers occupying the same family story. When she left, I realized something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. We'd both been playing roles that were too small for who we really were. Maybe it was time to write a different script. 2 days after our hotel conversation, I was back in my Arlington apartment, trying to pretend that life could return to normal when my secure phone rang at 6 in the morning. "Ms. Harper." The voice was crisp, official, unfamiliar. "This is Agent Sarah Mitchell, Defense Counterintelligence. We need you to come in for questioning regarding a security breach." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips. "What kind of breach?" "Operational fragments from Black Viper have been leaked to a fringe military blog. Your name appears in some of the classified materials that were posted." The blog was called Inside the Wire, one of those conspiracy theory sites, that mixed legitimate insider information with wild speculation about government cover-ups. Normally, anything posted there could be dismissed as the ravings of disgruntled former personnel with too much time and too many grudges. But when I pulled up the site on my laptop, my blood went cold. Someone had posted actual operational fragments. Not complete files, but enough detail to compromise ongoing intelligence methods. Psychological profiles of foreign assets, communication intercepts that revealed source networks, technical specifications for disinformation campaigns that were still being used in active operations. And threaded through it all like a signature on a classified document were references to M. Harper as the actual strategic architect of Black Viper. I was at the Defense Counterintelligence Office within 2 hours, walking through security checkpoints that felt more like medical examinations, metal detectors, biometric scanners, questions about every electronic device I'd touched in the past 72 hours. Agent Mitchell was exactly what central casting would order for a federal investigator. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of handshake that suggested she'd learned early never to show weakness. She led me to an interview room that managed to be both sterile and intimidating. Ms. Harper, I want to be clear that you're not under arrest or suspicion at this time. We're interviewing everyone with knowledge of Black Viper operations to determine how this breach occurred. I nodded. I'll cooperate fully. And I did. For 3 hours, I answered questions about my current security practices, my electronic communications, my contact with foreign nationals, my financial records. Everything that might suggest I'd been compromised or turned or simply grown careless after 20 years of handling classified information. By the end of the interview, Agent Mitchell seemed satisfied that I wasn't the source of the leak, but she also seemed puzzled. The technical details in these posts are too accurate to be fabricated, she said. Someone with intimate knowledge of the operation provided this information, but the posting pattern suggests amateur-hour basic operational security mistakes that a professional would never make. She pulled up the blog posts on her laptop screen. Look at the timestamps. The original documents were uploaded at 3:47 a.m. from an IP address that traces back to Fort Belvoir, then deleted and re-uploaded 20 minutes later from the same location as if someone had second thoughts, but didn't understand that deletion doesn't mean the files weren't already archived by the blog's servers. Fort Belvoir, where Erica was currently stationed. Agent Mitchell, I said carefully, I'd like to request permission to examine the metadata on those files. She raised an eyebrow. Why ding? Because I think whoever leaked this information didn't mean to leak it. I think they made a mistake, and understanding that mistake might help you trace the actual source. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a secure computer terminal room, scrolling through digital forensics data that painted a clear picture of bureaucratic carelessness. The leaked files had been accessed from Terminal 47B at Fort Belvoir's Communications Center. The login credentials belonged to Lieutenant Colonel candidate Erica Harper, who had checked into the facility at 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday night for what her duty log described as promotion paperwork review. According to the access logs, she'd logged into her terminal at 9:45 p.m. and remained active until 11:20 p.m. But here's where it got interesting. Her session remained active until 3:47 a.m., even though the physical access logs showed her leaving the building at 11:25 p.m. She'd left her terminal logged in overnight on a network that was supposed to be secure, but actually connected to systems that backed up to off-site servers that were less carefully monitored. But that wasn't the most damaging discovery. While examining the file access history, I found something that made my chest tighten with a familiar ache. Buried in Erica's user directory was a drafts folder containing an unsent email dated 6 months ago. The recipient field showed the contact address for Inside the Wire. The subject line read, Black Viper Truth. I opened it. I've been reading your blog for months, and I think you should know that the official story about Operation Black Viper isn't complete. My sister Madeline Harper was involved in strategic planning, and some sources suggest she may have inflated her role in post-operation reports. I have access to personnel files that might interest you, but I need assurance of anonymity before I can share anything specific. She'd never sent it. The email had been saved as a draft, probably while she wrestled with guilt or conscience or simple fear of consequences. But saving it on an open network was like leaving your front door wide open with a post-it note saying secrets inside. When the automated backup systems archived her drafts folder to the less secure offsite servers, that email became accessible to anyone who knew how to look. And someone had been looking. Someone who'd used her words as a roadmap to the classified files she'd had access to during her Black Viper logistics assignment. I stared at the screen, understanding finally settling like lead in my stomach. Erica hadn't leaked the classified information deliberately, but her moment of doubt, her brief consideration of setting the record straight, had created the vulnerability that someone else had exploited. The irony was sharp enough to cut. In trying to diminish my role in Black Viper, she'd accidentally created the security breach that was now threatening to expose everything we'd all worked to keep hidden. Agent Mitchell appeared at my shoulder. "Find something," I pointed to the screen. "I found your amateur mistake and your professional exploitation." She leaned in to read the draft email, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to understanding to grim satisfaction. "Well," she said, finally, "this just got a lot more complicated." The call came that evening while I was sitting in my apartment staring at takeout I had no appetite for. The number wasn't in my contacts, but the voice was one I hadn't heard in 15 years and would recognize anywhere. "Madeline. This is General Richard Cormack." Retired General Cormack, former Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. The man who'd recruited me out of the academy, who'd overseen my early psychological warfare training, who'd disappeared from my life when I'd accepted the trade of silence for operational security. "General," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected." "I imagine it is. I understand you've been helping Agent Mitchell with her investigation into the Black Viper breach." Of course he knew. Richard Cormack had the kind of network that meant he knew about security breaches before the people investigating them finished writing their reports. "I have," I confirmed. "Good. Because I just pulled some strings to get you brought in as external consultant on the response team. If you're willing." I set down my chopsticks. "What kind of response team?" "The kind that finds whoever exploited your sister's security lapse and makes sure they don't do it again. The kind that contains the damage before it spreads to operations that are still running." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old regrets and new necessities. "Madeline, I know how this family situation has played out. I know what we asked of you 20 years ago, and I know the price you've paid for that silence. But right now, you're the only person with the psychological warfare expertise. We need to trace how this breach actually happened and who's really behind it. What makes you think it's not just Erica's carelessness? Because Careless doesn't upload classified files at 3 a.m. and then delete them 20 minutes later. That's someone who knows exactly what they're doing, but wants it to look like an amateur mistake. The Defense Intelligence Agency's Crisis Response Center looked exactly like what it was, a room designed for managing disasters before they became catastrophes. Wall-mounted screens showed threat assessments, communication intercepts, and damage control timelines. The energy was controlled urgency, everyone moving with purpose, but no one quite running. Agent Mitchell introduced me to the team as Ms. Harper, external consultant with specialized knowledge of Black Viper operations. No rank, no authority, just my brain and 20 years of experience reading the psychology of people who dealt in secrets. Erica was already there, sitting at a conference table, like a defendant at her own trial. She'd been called in to provide technical clarification about her security protocols, but mostly she just watched in silence as strangers dissected her mistakes. I took a seat across from her, our eyes meeting briefly before she looked away. There was shame there, but also something else. Relief, maybe. The exhausting weight of carrying someone else's achievements was finally being lifted from her shoulders. The team had been busy. Digital forensics had traced the leak's pathway through multiple servers, revealing a sophistication that went far beyond simple carelessness. Someone had used Erica's unsent draft as a roadmap, but they'd also injected additional classified material that she'd never had access to. "Look at this," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the team's cyber intelligence specialist. She pulled up side-by-side comparisons of the leaked files. "The documents your sister could have accessed are here highlighted in blue. But the really damaging material, the operational methods, the source networks, the ongoing intelligence, that's in red. She never had clearance for any of it." I studied the screen, seeing patterns that others might miss. Someone used her legitimate access as cover for their own leak. Made it look like security negligence when it was actually intentional intelligence transfer. Exactly, but who? That's when I noticed something in the metadata timestamps. The files had been accessed in a specific sequence, not alphabetical, not chronological, but in order of operational relevance. Someone who understood how psychological warfare campaigns were structured, who knew which documents would be most valuable to foreign intelligence services. Pull up the access logs for everyone who worked on Black Viper, I said. Not just operational personnel, administrative support, technical analysts, anyone who might have had peripheral knowledge of how the mission was structured. It took 2 hours of cross-referencing personnel files with digital access patterns, but eventually a name surfaced that made several pieces click into place. Lieutenant Miles Renner, former intelligence analyst who'd been assigned to Black Viper's documentation review during the mission's classified assessment phase. He'd been present for technical briefings, had access to operational summaries, and had been quietly transferred out of the intelligence community 6 months after the mission concluded. His separation papers cited philosophical differences with current intelligence methodologies and concerns about operational ethics in psychological warfare applications. Dr. Walsh pulled up his file. Renner was passed over for promotion twice after Black Viper. His efficiency reports show declining performance, and what his supervisor described as inappropriate questioning of mission parameters. A grudge. Classic motivation for intelligence betrayal, not ideology or money, but wounded pride and professional resentment. He's been working as a private security consultant since leaving the military, Agent Mitchell added. Contracts with firms that provide services to foreign clients. Perfectly legal, but it would give him access to people who might be very interested in American intelligence capabilities. I looked at the evidence spreading across the screens around us, the careful timing of the breach, the sophisticated understanding of which documents would cause maximum damage, the professional exploitation of Erica's amateur mistake. He's been watching her, I said finally, probably monitoring her digital activity for months waiting for an opportunity. When she saved that draft email, it gave him the opening he needed. Her legitimate access provided cover for his intentional leak. Erica spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. So this is my fault. I turned to her, seeing my sister instead of the stranger she'd become over 20 years of borrowed glory. No, I said. This is what happens when good people make mistakes and bad people exploit them. You didn't betray anyone. You just gave someone else the chance to betray everyone. General Cormack leaned forward. Ms. Harper, what's your assessment of Renner's next move? I thought about the psychology of revenge, about the particular satisfaction that comes from destroying something piece by piece, rather than all at once. He's not done, I said. This was just the opening move. I was right about Miles Renner not being finished, but wrong about how much time we had. Within 18 hours of identifying him as the source, federal agents found him in a Baltimore hotel room with a laptop full of additional classified materials and communication records showing contact with intelligence services from 3 different countries. He didn't resist arrest. According to Agent Mitchell, he actually seemed relieved that it was over. The psychology of revenge often includes an unconscious desire to be caught. The satisfaction isn't complete until someone acknowledges what you've done. He's been planning this for almost 2 years, she told me over coffee in the Pentagon cafeteria. The Black Viper leak was just the beginning. He had files ready to release from 6 other operations, all designed to embarrass the psychological warfare program and expose what he called unethical manipulation of foreign assets. I stirred sugar into my coffee, thinking about the particular kind of betrayal that comes from someone who once shared your mission, but lost faith in your methods. Renner wasn't a foreign agent or a financial opportunist. He was a true believer who'd become disillusioned, which made him both more dangerous and more predictable than someone motivated purely by greed. What happens to him now? Federal prison, probably 25 years. His cooperation with the investigation might reduce that. But espionage charges don't leave much room for mercy. I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of consequences that ripple outward from decisions made in classified rooms. Renner's career was over, his freedom was gone, and his idealistic crusade against psychological warfare had accomplished nothing except proving why such operations needed to remain secret. But the larger question remained: what happened to the rest of us? 3 days after Renner's arrest, Erica appeared at my apartment door, carrying a manila folder and wearing civilian clothes. She looked smaller without her uniform, more vulnerable, like someone who'd been playing a role for so long that removing the costume left her uncertain about who she really was. "I submitted this to the review board this morning," she said, handing me the folder. Inside was a single sheet of official letterhead with her signature at the bottom. "To the Joint Military Ethics Review Board, I hereby request my commendation for Operation Black Viper be revised to reflect secondary contribution. The psychological warfare strategy executed under this operation was not designed by me. My role was limited to logistics coordination and asset management during the mission's final phase. Lieutenant Colonel Madeline Harper was the primary strategic architect of the psychological operations that led to the mission's success. I recommend that the official record be corrected to reflect accurate attribution of operational planning and strategic innovation. Respectfully submitted, Lieutenant Colonel Candidate Erica Harper." I read it twice, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "Yes, I did. Not because of the investigation or the security breach or any external pressure, because I've been living someone else's life for 20 years and I'm tired of it." She sat down on my couch, folding her hands in her lap, the way she'd done as a child when she was preparing to confess some small crime. "The promotion is frozen," she continued. "Not revoked, just on hold pending review of my actual service record. They'll probably approve it eventually, but it won't be for Black Viper anymore. It'll be for the work I actually did." "And how do you feel about that?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Scared, relieved. Like I can finally breathe without wondering if someone's going to figure out that I don't deserve the air." The official response was exactly what I'd expected: bureaucratic and minimal. No public announcements, no congressional hearings, no dramatic reversals of 20-year-old decisions. The Black Viper operational record was quietly amended in classified files that most people would never see. My name was restored to documents that would remain locked in secure servers. No one clapped, no one apologized. No one offered the recognition that had been withheld or the explanations that had been owed. But for the first time in 20 years, that was okay. Because I'd learned something important during those days in Pentagon conference rooms and hotel lobbies, and late-night conversations with my sister. Silence doesn't need to be broken. It needs to be reclaimed. For 2 decades, I'd lived with imposed silence, the kind that comes from other people's decisions about what you're allowed to say and what story you're allowed to tell. That silence had weight, had power over me, had shaped my relationships and my sense of self. But the silence I carried now was different. It was chosen silence, deliberate silence, the silence of someone who no longer needed external validation to know her own worth. Erica would build her career on her own achievements now. My parents would have to adjust their understanding of which daughter had served with distinction. The family narrative would become more complicated, less convenient, but more honest. And I would continue the work I'd always done, the quiet, invisible, essential work of protecting national security through psychological operations that would never make headlines or earn public praise. The difference was that now I wasn't disappearing. I was simply choosing when and how to be seen. General Cormack had offered me a permanent consulting position with the intelligence community. Not a return to active duty, not official rank or recognition, just the opportunity to continue designing the kind of operations that prevented conflicts instead of winning them. I'd accepted. Because some battles are won, not by being the loudest voice in the room, but by being the clearest one. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is speak so quietly that people have to lean in to hear the truth. The ghost had decided to remain a ghost, but now it was by choice, not by erasure. And that made all the difference. 6 months after the Black Viper files were amended, I received an invitation that caught me completely off guard. The letterhead was simple, elegant: NATO Strategic Intelligence Symposium. The kind of gathering where policies were shaped by people whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, where the real work of international security happened in conference rooms, rather than briefing rooms. Dr. Madeline Harper, the invitation read, "You are cordially invited to present the keynote address on psychological operations in modern conflict resolution at our annual closed session in Brussels." Dr. Harper, they'd done their research, found the PhD in strategic psychology I'd earned through night classes while running covert operations, a doctorate that had never appeared on any official military record. never been celebrated by my family, never been anything more than a line on a classified personnel file. Now it was opening doors I'd never expected to walk through. The conference was everything I'd imagined, and nothing like I'd prepared for. 300 of the most influential intelligence professionals in the Western world gathered in a room that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a military facility. No uniforms, no rank insignia, just sharp suits and sharper minds focused on problems that didn't have simple solutions. I stood at the podium looking out at faces I recognized from classified briefings, from intelligence summaries, from news reports that never quite told the complete story. These were the people who shaped policy, who decided which operations received funding, who determined the difference between national security and international incident. And sitting in the front row, wearing a navy blue suit and taking notes like any other attendee, was Erica. Not as the star, not as the celebrated strategist who'd once been credited with innovative psychological warfare techniques. As a student there to learn from people whose work she was finally beginning to understand. I opened with words I'd been thinking about for 20 years, but had never had the opportunity to speak aloud. Some wars are fought with maps and bombs, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. Others are fought in rooms where the only weapon is being believed. I talked about psychological operations not as abstract theory, but as practical necessity. About the choice between destroying enemies and making them destroy themselves. About the difference between winning conflicts and preventing them from starting. The most successful military operation, I continued, is the one that never has to be acknowledged. The crisis that never develops the conflict, that never escalates the war that never begins, because the people who might have started it can no longer trust each other enough to coordinate their efforts. I described psychological warfare as surgical precision applied to human motivation. Not propaganda or manipulation, but strategic intervention in the decision-making processes of people who dealt in violence and ideology. We study their fears, their ambitions, their relationships, their psychological vulnerabilities. Then we design scenarios that make their worst instincts work against their own interests. We don't change their minds, we create conditions where they change their own minds. The questions afterward were sharp, technical, exactly what I'd expected from people who understood the implications of what I was describing. How do you measure success in operations that officially don't exist? How do you maintain ethical boundaries when your job is to exploit psychological weaknesses? How do you balance operational effectiveness with diplomatic necessity? I answered honestly, drawing on 2 decades of experience I'd never been allowed to discuss publicly. For 45 minutes, I was exactly who I'd always been, an expert in psychological warfare operations, speaking to colleagues who understood the complexity and necessity of the work. When the session ended, Erica approached the podium. She didn't congratulate me or offer commentary on my presentation. She simply asked the kind of question that suggested she was thinking seriously about psychological operations for the first time. How do you live with the uncertainty, she said, never knowing if your interventions prevented something terrible or just postponed it? I looked at my sister, not the woman who'd borrowed my achievements, but the intelligence officer who was finally ready to understand what those achievements had actually required. You focus on the lives you can save, I told her, not the recognition you'll never receive. She nodded, making another note in her leather portfolio, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like we were speaking the same language. That evening, over drinks in a Brussels hotel bar, she told me about the new position she'd accepted, training coordinator for psychological operations awareness, teaching intelligence personnel how to recognize and counter the kind of warfare I'd spent my career perfecting. I finally found work I can do with my actual skills, she said. It's not as glamorous as what I was doing before, but it's real. Real is better than borrowed, I replied. She smiled, raising her glass. To doing our own work. To doing work that matters, I corrected. We drank to that, 2 sisters who'd finally learned the difference. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in spring, small enough to fit in my mailbox, but heavy enough to make me curious. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I recognized, but hadn't seen in years, careful, precise, the penmanship of someone who'd learned early that details mattered. Inside was something I'd forgotten existed: my grandfather's watch. It was a 1943 Hamilton military timepiece that had belonged to Colonel William Harper, my father's father, who'd served in the Pacific Theater and come home with stories he never told and a watch he never took off. When he died, it had been passed to my father, who'd worn it through his own military career until the day he retired. I'd assumed it would go to Erica, eventually the daughter who'd followed the family tradition, who'd earned the right to carry forward his legacy of service. I hadn't seen it in 20 years, hadn't even thought about it, until I held it in my hands and felt the weight of accumulated time. But this wasn't the broken watch I remembered from childhood, the one that had stopped working sometime in the 1990s and been relegated to a drawer full of military memorabilia. This was restored, polished running with the precise rhythm of a timepiece that had been carefully repaired by someone who understood its value. The note tucked beneath it was written on Erica's personal stationery. "Maddie, Dad gave this to me when I made Lieutenant Colonel, said it belonged to the daughter who'd served with distinction. I had it repaired, but it never felt right on my wrist. I think Grandpa would want it to go to the granddaughter who actually earned it. This time, the time is yours." I fastened the leather strap around my wrist, feeling the subtle weight of 3 generations of military service. The watch face caught the morning light, its hands moving forward with mechanical certainty, marking moments that belonged to me now instead of to someone else's version of my story. 3 months later, I was walking through the Pentagon's main corridor when I noticed something that made me stop mid-stride. The War Strategy Wall, that marble monument to successful military operations that stretched along the building's central hallway, had been updated. New engravings had been added to commemorate recent missions, their details carved in the same formal script that had immortalized decades of American military achievement. Most of the additions were exactly what you'd expect: operation names, commanding officers, dates of completion. The kind of public recognition that came with traditional military success. But near the bottom, in smaller text that you'd have to look closely to notice, was a line that made my breath catch: Black Viper, operational lead compartmentalized. Confirmed by Directive 17B. No name, no specific attribution, just acknowledgement that the operation had existed, that it had been successful, and that its true leadership remained classified for reasons of national security. It wasn't the recognition I'd once thought I wanted. There would be no photographs of tourists pointing to my name, no family members bringing visitors to see where their daughter's achievement was memorialized. Most people walking past wouldn't even understand what they were reading. But for someone who knew the story, for someone who understood the language of compartmentalized operations and classified directives, it was enough. It was proof that truth has its own weight, its own momentum, its own way of surfacing, even when it's been buried under decades of convenient fiction. I stood there for a long time watching other people pass, without noticing the small addition to the wall. Pentagon staff hurrying to meetings, visitors on official tours, military personnel who had their own missions to worry about. None of them knew that they were walking past the acknowledgement of a psychological warfare operation that had prevented dozens of terrorist attacks, saved thousands of lives, and changed the way intelligence agencies thought about winning conflicts without fighting them. And that was exactly how it should be. Because I'd finally learned what I should have understood 20 years ago. My name was never the point. The work was the point. The lives saved were the point. The conflicts prevented were the point. But now, for the first time since I disappeared into the classified world of psychological operations, my name was no longer a ghost. It was simply waiting, patient and quiet, for the moment when silence could finally speak louder than any recognition. That moment had arrived, and it was enough. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life or erased from your own achievements, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Sometimes knowing that someone else understands makes the silence a little less heavy. Thank you for listening to my truth. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please consider subscribing. Every voice matters, including yours.